Hello everyone and welcome. Thank you so much for joining the channel, but in this video we're taking a look at Witherhoard paired with a selection of heavy weapons. I've chosen 2 rocket launchers, 3 grenade launchers and thrown Falling Guillotine in there for good measure, now that I finally have a god roll. So those weapons are, starting with the rocket launchers, Apex Predator from the Last Wish raid with alloy casting, speeding up reload time and auto load and holster. Shining Sphere with alloy casting and auto load and holster as well, but also Demolitionist. For the grenade launchers, I've chosen Interference 6 with spike grenade, field prep and full court. I would have preferred to test this with auto load and holster, but I couldn't get one with that perk in time, so field prep will have to do. Berenger's Memory with spike grenade, field prep and demolitionist, followed by the same again, but instead of demolitionist, auto load and holster. And Swarm of the Raven with spike grenades and pulse monitor. I actually turned in over 1500 Iron Banner tokens to try and get one with field prep or auto load and holster, but RNG wasn't kind to me, so pulse monitor it is. The one I used though did have quick draw, which helped a little when switching back from Witherhoard, of which has been taken into consideration for DPS. And finally, as mentioned, a god roll Falling Guillotine with Jagged Edge, Swordmaster's Guard and Whirlwind Blade. I understand Relentless Strikes is also considered to be part of that god roll, but that doesn't increase DPS, just the time that you can maintain damage. And just out of curiosity, I've included Falling Guillotine on its own, so no Witherhoard. The only assumptions are that a generic heavy reloader mod was equipped, the rocket launchers both had a major spec mod, as testing was against Greg, the grenade launchers all had a backup mag mod, while Falling Guillotine had a major spec mod too, and I also masterworked it, to see what it was capable of. The structure of the video will look at the method testing for each weapon and perk combination, a little on the numbers detailing total damage, and then we'll move on to the graph where final DPS will be revealed and all weapons compared. So, let's begin with Apex Predator. For this method, as demonstrated on screen now, you start off with 2 rounds from Witherhoard, one fired directly at the target, then reload and fire at the floor as close as possible. Then switch to Apex and fire 3 rounds, obviously meaning you need to reload twice. After the 3rd round, switch to Witherhoard and fire 2 more rounds as you did at the start. Upon switching back to Apex, it will now be reloaded due to the auto load and holster perk, and you can fire another 3 rounds with only 2 reloads. This does 2 lots of damage, one being impact and the other being blast damage. I quickly tested the difference between projectile velocity and blast radius perks, etc, but the total damage per round came out the same. In this case, 43,016. A total of 6 rounds can be held with nothing to boost this, so when paired with Witherhoard for the method described above, total damage comes in at 453,475. Shining Sphere now, and the method for this requires you to fire 2 rounds from Witherhoard as before, switch back to the rocket launcher, and after your first round is fired, throw a grenade to reload. Then fire 2 more rounds with only 1 reload, before switching to Witherhoard and firing another 2 rounds from that. When you go back to Shining Sphere, it will now be reloaded due to the auto load and holster perk and fire the remaining 3 rounds. This holds the same number as Apex Predator, that being 6, and does the same amount of damage for each of those rounds. The grenade damage measured was that of a Warlock's fusion grenade, with total damage altogether coming in at 461,333. Onto the grenade launchers now, starting with Interference 6. As said, this has spike grenades, field prep and full court. Of course, to achieve these numbers you need to be at least 45 meters away from the target in order to get the full benefit of full court. For this method, as with the rocket launchers, start with 2 rounds fired from Witherhoard, 1 at the target and 1 at the floor, then switch to Interference 6 and empty 2 magazines. Just make sure you've crouched when reloading to benefit from field prep. Once the second magazine has been emptied, before reloading, switch back to Witherhoard and fire 2 more rounds from that, as you did at the start. Then switch back to the grenade launcher, reload and empty the last magazine, which will be 4. Total damage for this method, with 18 rounds in total, comes in at 609,458. Next is Berenger's Memory with spike grenade, field prep and demolitionist. This will follow the same method as Interference 6 for the most part, starting with 2 rounds from Witherhoard and then switching back to the grenade launcher. Only after emptying the first magazine, throw a grenade to reload. Then empty the second magazine and switch to Witherhoard, firing another 2 rounds from that, remembering it's 1 at the target followed by 1 at the floor. Then switch back to Berenger's Memory, reload and empty the remaining 2 rounds, ensuring that you crouch throughout this to benefit from field prep. Now, a final magazine for this will only have 1 round in, which isn't great for DPS, bringing the total that you can fire to 22. That means damage for this method is 602,916, falling just short of interference 6. And quickly now for Berenger's memory with auto-load and holster in place of Demolitionist. This still has 22 rounds in the magazine and requires 3 reloads. The difference here is, once you fire 2 shots from Witherhoard for the second time, upon switching back to the grenade launcher, it'll be reloaded because of the auto-load and holster perk. Now remember to make sure you stay crouched for the other 2 reloads to benefit from field prep. Total damage for this method is 563,285. Quite a bit less than with Demolitionist, but that's because there's no grenade damage, and this method fires every round faster, meaning less tick damage from Witherhoard has been taken into consideration. Now for Swarm of the Raven with spike grenades, pulse monitor and quick draw. As I've said, I would have preferred to test this with field prep or auto load and holster, but I couldn't get one to drop with them rolls. But at least with pulse monitor though, it adds a little diversity to the perks tested, even if they are on different weapons. For the method tested here, as always, start with 2 rounds fired from Witherhoard, then switch back to Swarm of the Raven and empty the first magazine. But for the final round, fire it at the ground in front of you to drop your health into the red. If you get this right and don't kill yourself, the weapon will now be reloaded. Then, empty the 7 rounds in this magazine and switch to Witherhoard to fire 2 more rounds from that, without reloading the heavy grenade launcher. Once you've switched back to Swarm of the Raven, now reload, empty the last of the rounds remaining in the final magazine, of which there'll only be 6, as this holds a maximum of 20 with nothing to boost it. Total damage for this method comes in at 507,720. Damage may seem a little low, but remember, there's no grenade like Berenger's memory with Demolitionist, you don't have field prep, which increases reserves, and you've just fired 1 round at the ground in order to proc pulse monitor. Still, reasonably respectable damage. Now finally, a God Roll Falling Guillotine that comes with the perks Jagged Edge, Swordmaster's Guard, Whirlwind Blade has been masterworked and also has a major spec mod. The use of Witherhoard is a little different with this weapon, as rather than firing 2 rounds, you just fire 1 directly at the target. The reason for this is, in my video that looks at different ways to pair these 2 weapons, it came out on top with the highest DPS. It might seem unfair on the other weapons to change things and masterwork it, but I wanted to test this combo with a God Roll sword at some point before the season ended, as all my previous testing has been done with the season pass variant. Until now. So the method starts off with 1 round fired from Witherhoard at the target, then switch to the sword and do the usual 5 strikes until Whirlwind Blade is procced at ×5, then use a heavy attack. Then do 7 light attacks, which with Swordmaster's Guard is the minimum required before sword energy is fully recharged, and then follow up those with a heavy attack. Now switch to Witherhoard and fire another round at the target. Unfortunately though, while the sword is stowed, its energy doesn't recharge, meaning when you get it back out, it's still pretty much empty from the heavy attack you just did. Therefore, now do 7 light attacks, not 5, before executing a heavy. And from here on out, it's 2 lots of 7 light attacks, each followed by a heavy attack in between 1 round fired from Witherhoard, if that makes sense. It has been demonstrated on screen as I'm talking you through it. Now, I've only calculated this up to just over 30 seconds, but even so, total damage is coming in at a huge 1,452,762. Now, let's take a look at this on the graph, starting with Apex Predator. As you can see, I've recorded the damage from each round as happening in an instant, hence the vertical climb for each rocket fired. The slightly longer flat section in the middle is where you switch back to Witherhoard and fire 2 more rounds, with every other slightly shorter flat section being normal reloads. Total time for this method is 17.32 seconds, so with total damage being 453,475, DPS is therefore 26,182. Not too bad for a rocket launcher, even though it is paired with Witherhoard. Next up is Shining Sphere, but this time with Demolitionist as well. You can see where it does its second round of damage, that it happens a little sooner due to reloading by throwing a grenade, and there's extra damage there as well from that grenade. This allows it to pull ahead of Apex Predator just about, but then stay there. Total time for this is 16.36 seconds, so with total damage at 461,333. Remember, that's with a Warlock's fusion grenade. DPS is 28,199. Now it's time for Interference 6, and it's in a different league to the rocket launchers really. Damage from the first magazine starts a little earlier than Apex and Shining Sphere, as I found I was able to switch and start firing sooner. After that, you're seeing 7 rounds fired, reload, another 7 rounds, switch to Witherhoard and fire 2 more from that, then back to Interference 6, reload and fire the remaining 4 rounds in the final magazine. The time taken to do this is 17.29 seconds, so with total damage at 609,458, DPS is 35,249. Up next is Berenger's Memory, but this first one is with Demolitionist in the final perk column. You can see it immediately falls behind Interference 6, pulls ahead for a brief moment for the first reload where a grenade is thrown, but then falls behind again and never gets back in front. Of course, if you had Pulse Monitor and Exotic Armor that allows 2 grenades to be thrown, Demolitionist could be procced twice, and it could quite possibly come out on top. But that's with Exotic Armor, and I didn't want anything in this test to rely on something like that. The long flat section in the middle, as with Interference 6, is when you fire 2 rounds from Witherhoard again, then switch back to Berenger's Memory and need to reload. And that small little vertical climb right at the very end is the final magazine where only 1 round was fired. Total time for this was 19.31 seconds, so with total damage of 602,916, DPS comes in at 31,223. Now, I am going to address these lower than expected DPS numbers once every weapon is on the graph. Now, Berenger's Memory again, but instead of Demolitionist, it's Auto-Load and Holster in the final perk slot. As you can see, it matches Demolitionist Berenger's Memory up until that grenade is thrown, but it now falls behind. But you may also notice that the longer flat section in the middle, where you fire 2 rounds from Witherhoard, is shorter. And that's of course because when you change back to Berenger's Memory, Auto-Load and Holster has reloaded your weapon, so you can start firing again straight away. This then allows it to briefly pull ahead of the Demolitionist variant, but then it falls behind during the final reload. Damage is slightly less as there's no grenade thrown, coming in at 563,285, but time for this method is also less, at 18.4. Remember though, that means less tick damage from Witherhoard has been recorded. Either way, with those damage and time numbers, DPS comes in at 31,052, ever so slightly behind Berenger's Memory with Demolitionist. And the last of the grenade launchers, Swarm of the Raven. Now on listing the perks for each weapon, I did say this has quick draw, and that can be seen at the start of the first magazine where damage begins before the other 2 grenade launchers, and that's simply because you can switch and start firing from it sooner. The first reload section is using Pulse Monitor to reload, hence why it's so short, and that's enough to briefly catapult it past the other grenade launchers. It then falls behind when firing 2 rounds from Witherhoard and switching back to the grenade launcher to reload, etc. But for its final magazine, where there's only 6 rounds, it pulls ahead of both Berenger's Memory variants, and for a split second after firing all rounds, it's actually ahead of Interference 6. All other grenade launchers do more damage, and that's because firstly, you waste a round with Swarm of the Raven in order to proc Pulse Monitor, and because it empties every round faster than the others, so there's less tick damage from Witherhoard. And also don't forget there's no field prep, so it has less in reserves. Anyway, total time for this method is 15.46 seconds, so with total damage at 507,720, DPS is 32,841, which beats both Berenger's Memory, but not quite Interference 6. And finally, Falling Guillotine. Remember, as I've already said, this doesn't only have what most people consider to be god roll perks, but also a major spec mod and is masterworked. I'm going to change the graph now by just replacing it with one where the X and Y axis go to higher numbers. As you can probably guess what's coming. And yeah, other than that short delay at the start where you're fired in 1 round from Witherhoard, this is well ahead for the whole time. It's not even close. There's a split second around 10.5 seconds where Interference 6 isn't too far behind, but that's it. The sword then just keeps on climbing. It does more damage at any given moment and can maintain this damage for over 30 seconds. The rocket and grenade launchers just can't compete. Each flat section as you climb up the graph is just where you're firing another round from Witherhoard at the target. I've timed this over 31.68 seconds, of course it could go for longer, and that's after the third and final round from Witherhoard has been fired, followed by 2 sets of 7 light attacks and a heavy, with total damage over this time being 1,452,762, DPS comes in at 45,857. This puts Falling Guillotine and Witherhoard back at the top of the table for having the best DPS I've ever tested, beating first in last out with Anarchy by over 1,000. So, time to address the lower than expected DPS numbers, as I know there's a good chance you're wondering what's going on. So the thing with Witherhoard is that it incurs a lot of downtime to get the best tick damage, that being fired in 2 rounds. This downtime where you're not using your main damage weapon means DPS takes a hit because you're spending a lot of time reloading Witherhoard and firing from that, rather than doing strong damage with your main weapon. Now, I know I could have utilised Witherhoard's Catalyst ability better by firing 1 round, switching back to the grenade launcher, then back to Witherhoard for the 2nd round after it's auto-reloaded, but this would introduce an awful lot of flats and rises on the graph, potentially making it a little awkward to understand what's going on and where you're up to. The method would also be more difficult due to having to perfectly execute any switching, so I decided not to do it that way. If you only fired 1 round from Witherhoard and just cracked on, DPS probably would be a little higher, but total damage would be significantly less, and you'll burn through your grenade launcher ammo even faster. But that's a decision that you as the player need to make. If you have a very small damage phase window, 1 round from Witherhoard could be the better choice. Anything that's over 15 seconds, consider firing 2 rounds for the extra tick damage. With Anarchy on the other hand, it takes 2 rounds from that to get the best tick damage as well, admittedly, but that can fire those 2 rounds without the need to reload in between, and it can do that 3 times as it holds 6 in the magazine. Couple that with the fact it actually does a little more DPS than Witherhoard, and they're the 2 main reasons when a weapon is paired with Anarchy, for example the Icolos Sniper, that we do see a huge increase to DPS. And just to quickly demonstrate the effect that downtime from Witherhoard has, coming onto the screen now is Falling Guillotine on its own. So admittedly, when paired with Witherhoard, it is ahead most of the time, but the sword on its own closes the gap every time you switch to the grenade launcher to fire another round, and that's simply because Falling Guillotine does huge amounts of damage that you're missing out on when not using it. Not to mention every time it comes back out, you need to proc Whirlwind Blade again. Personally, I rarely combine these 2 weapons, and if I do, it's mainly because Witherhoard is excellent for ad clearing or when there are multiple targets. No surprises then with the results, other than slightly lower than expected DPS, but the sword is in a totally different league, not just for damage per second, but also total damage that it's capable of inflicting over long periods of time. And on that note, it's all from me. I hope you enjoyed the video and found it helpful. If you did, please do subscribe and like, or even dislike, and give me some feedback in the comments. As always, thank you very much for watching. I'll see you next time.